Back to the heat. We are discussing Russia's annexation of Crimea and the fallout for international relations. Could we be headed back into a Cold War? Joining me now from Moscow is Dmitry Babich. He's a political analyst with Voice of Russia Radio, and we want to welcome you to the heat. Thanks so much for joining us, Dmitry. The view from Western leaders, including President Obama, is that this is an illegal action. It's basically a land grab. So I want to get the Russian perspective there in Moscow. How's it seen there?
It's certainly not seen as a land grab because, indeed, if you have ever been to Crimea, you may see that the vast majority of the population there always felt Russian, feels Russian, and you may say whatever you want about this referendum in Crimea, but even the staunchest critics of this referendum acknowledge that the majority of Crimeans, the vast majority of Crimeans, wants to be part of Russia. They want to be citizens of Russia. And certainly the process of reunification of Crimea and Russia would have never happened if it had not been for this Maidan affair in Kiev, which is seen in Russia as a violent seizure of power. Putin uses the word coup d'etat, and even Putin's critics from Kiev, my friends, even they acknowledge that if it was not a coup d'etat, then at least it was a violent seizure of power, of course.
Well, let me ask.
Indeed, I don't see how the West can achieve anything with sanctions, because what do they want Putin to do? Just to come to Crimeans and say, okay, all this referendum was a joke. Now back to reality, you are back in Ukraine. That's not going to happen anyway.
Well, let me ask you this. The Lithuanian president late in the week had said that what we're seeing is the makings perhaps of a new Cold War. Is that a concern, and is that a view that may also be shared there in Russia?
Well, I think that unfortunately it's worse than the Cold War, because if you look at the rhetoric on both sides, it is certainly worse than it was during the Cold War. And certainly, even in the worst days of Cold War, Russians could not imagine that NATO warships would have, that there would be a remote possibility of NATO warships staying at Sevastopol. And that's what would happen if the new government in Kiev had its way. I think it's certainly not a new Cold War, because unlike the Soviet Union, Russia is connected to the West not only by modern means of communication, not only by internet, not only is there free press, but there is free press in Russia, but also we are economically very interconnected. On the other hand, the rhetoric on both sides is terrible. The threats from the West are terrible, and if you listen to what has been said in Kiev, in Washington, or in Brussels, you might get an impression that this is not a Cold War, but a real Third World War.
Do you see it spilling over into other former Soviet bloc nations, perhaps Georgia, Moldova? What do you see as the next stage in all of this?
Well, I think it's very unfortunate. Russia did not want this duel. Since 1991, when the Cold War finally ended, Russia viewed itself as just, the biggest part of the Soviet Union that would be integrated into the Western community of nations together with other post-Soviet states. But unfortunately, the West continued the same Cold War game. What happened in Ukraine was very unfortunate, because the Ukrainian government under Viktor Yanukovych was put by the European Union before a choice it hated to make. The European Union said it's going to be a civilizational choice. It's either us or Russia. It's either Europe or Russia. And for Ukraine, this choice is simply impossible to make, because this is a huge nation, 46 million people. It has been, or had been, in the same country with Russia for 350 years. So, severing all ties with Russia would be suicidal. On the other way, Ukrainians are Europeans. They want to be part of Europe. So saying goodbye to Western Europe would also be very, very unpleasant for them. So I think that what happened was very unfortunate, not only for Russia, but also for the West. you know, my friends from Al Jazeera and other stations, I hear them saying that the West looks puny now, and that's why we have such, you know, we have such an amount of noise in the West about these sanctions, about the need to punish Russia. Well, I agree that the West looks puny, but it's not because of Putin. It's because from the very beginning they made that terrible mistake. The West engaged itself 100% on the side of this radical Maidan movement, which included some very unsavory characters with real neo-Nazi phraseology. I mean, this Svoboda party. So the West made that mistake by engaging with the wrong people from the very beginning. Now it looks puny, yes.
Well, Dmitry, let me move on because we've got very little time. But I want to get your thoughts. Is there a way to diffuse this crisis and get both sides back together and come up with some sort of solution?
Sure, I think there is a way to do it. It's by starting a dialogue, taking into account the realities that exist already on the ground. I think it's both in the interest of Russia and in the interest of the West not to see the Ukrainian economy collapse. So we can only drag it out of the pit together. The West can provide financial assistance, something that it refused to provide to President Yanukovych. Russia is still the most important market for the Ukrainian industry. I'm not sure that Ukrainian products will gain for themselves the European markets in the near future. So we should proceed from this common interest. We don't want Ukraine to collapse. And you asked me what could be next after Ukraine. I'm afraid that the next battlefield could be Moldova, because there is a small territory called Transnistria, which declared itself independent of Moldova back in 1992. It's separated from Russia by the Ukrainian territory, but it also held a referendum several years ago proclaiming its desire to become part of Russia.
Well, Dmitry, we're going to have to...
Putin made it very clear that he would not go any further than Crimea,
Dmitry,
but it's still
I'm
a
sorry.
problem. It's still a danger.
We're going to have to leave it there. We've run out of time. But thank you so much for joining us from Moscow today.